Well, this morning we're picking back up in the Gospel of Mark. I was looking back at some notes over the last couple years, and I recognize we've been in the Gospel of Mark since the fall of 2016. Doesn't seem like that, does it? Like it's flown by, right? Some of you are like, no, it hasn't flown by, Pastor. Come on. And so we're in the Gospel of Mark, and if you're new to our church, the reason we've been in the Gospel of Mark so long is we practice a form of preaching called expository preaching, which means we believe the Bible is best taught by taking a book of the Bible like the Gospel of Mark, and then we walk through it chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and our goal is to better understand what it means for us even in our lives today. And really what the Gospel of Mark does is it has three goals. It shows us who Jesus is, it tells us what he came to do for us, and then it talks about what we need to do in response to him. And so as we come back to Mark today, we're coming back to chapter 12, and we're in the final week of Jesus' life as he heads for the cross. And as we've learned, it's been an eventful week because Jesus is really being attacked, verbally attacked by the religious leaders of his day as they're trying as hard as they can to discredit him. But as we've learned, their attacks have fallen short. In fact, Jesus is always one step ahead of them. He always cuts them off at the pass. And at this point, the religious leaders, they've kind of abandoned this idea that we can discredit Jesus. You know, Jesus has kind of proven he's a worthy adversary. They're not going to be able to get him verbally. And so now they will focus their efforts on actually killing him. And we will see that begin to play out in Mark chapter 14. But as we come to the end of chapter 12 today, we're coming to the end of Jesus' public ministry. In fact, beginning in chapter 13, Jesus will no longer speak publicly. He will speak to his disciples, and he will speak to them privately. And just to kind of give you a preview of chapter 13, if you're interested, how many of you are interested in the end times, like when Jesus is coming back and that kind of stuff? That's the question the disciples are going to ask him in chapter 13. And most of chapter 13 is focused on how will we know when the end is coming, Jesus? And wouldn't you like to know that? So make sure you're here for chapter 13. But as we come back to chapter 12 today, and as we come to the end of this chapter, Jesus has one final really public message that he's going to give, a message that honestly kind of sums up everything that he has said to this point. Everything, it's all about what it really means to follow him, can be summed up today in this one passage. So in order for us to understand ultimately what it means to follow Jesus, I want to kind of give us some framework to work with here, and I want to begin by asking you three questions. The first question is this: when it comes to your finances and to your livelihood, how many of you would say that you trust God? That you trust God. In other words, you know, it really does, you know that no matter how much money you make or don't make, you have this knowledge or this understanding of this belief that God is your provider and he's going to take care of you, right? I think most of us as Christians would admit to that or say that. Here's another question then for you. When it comes to your finances or your livelihood, how many of you would say that you trust God to the point that you're willing to give him a large percent of that trust? In other words, maybe another way to ask the question would be, what percent of your income or your livelihood would you trust God with? In other words, if God asked you to demonstrate your financial trust in him, what percent of your income would you be willing to designate to him? 1%? 5%? 10%? 25%, 50%, 100%? I mean, how far would you go if God asked you to trust him financially? That's a different question, isn't it? Third question. If you struggle to trust God financially, at what point, what level of income do you need to have in order to trust him financially? In other words, if you were going to tithe 10% or consider that, how much money would you need to make annually in order to be comfortable with that? How much would it take? $50,000? $100,000? $150,000? I mean, what dollar amount do you need to make annually in order to feel comfortable with trusting God with 10% of your income? What's that number? Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, wonderful. I came on the Sunday, again, that pastor's going to talk about tithing and giving. And some of you right now, you're thinking, I just wish I would have watched online, right? And if you're new to our church, you're thinking, that's just great. I knew it. I knew, they told me, that's what I heard at the theater, that's what I heard at the coffee shop. I knew this church is all about the money. Listen, if that's what's running through your mind right now, let me put everybody at ease, because today's sermon is not about tithing, and it's not about you giving more money to the church. There's no tithe challenge today. So everybody can relax. Everybody can kind of settle down. Breathe easy. The sermon isn't about you giving more money, all right? However, the passage today is about money. And the passage today is about giving certain amounts of money. Now, you might be thinking, well, Pastor, how can you say that it's not about money, but then you tell us it's about money? I can say that because what Jesus is going to challenge us to give isn't necessarily money, but he is going to challenge us to give something. Something that is necessary if you want to follow him. Something that is required if you want to be a disciple of Jesus. And because money tends to be really something that is near and dear to all of us, Jesus is going to use the subject of money to illustrate what you need to give him. So, before I confuse you anymore, here's what I want to do. First, I want to walk through the passage. I want to read through it. I want to give some explanation. And then second, I want to show you what Jesus is asking from us in order for us to follow him. So that is our basis. Let's pick back up in Mark chapter 12, verse 40, as Jesus delivers this final message, this public message. Listen to what Mark tells us. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put more in than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything that she had, all that she had to live on." I don't know about you, but I'm not a big mall fan. Anybody, you like going to the mall? Guys, love the mall. Not so much here. Honestly, it's like the last thing that I would want to do on a Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon is go walk around a mall endlessly, looking at stores endlessly, and probably not buying anything. In fact, if I'm going to go to the mall, I got a mission, right? I know what I want. I know where it's at. I'm going to get in and out. That's me in the mall. However, I do have 2 daughters I raised that like the mall. So I've spent some time in the mall. And what I've learned about the mall is I don't like walking around endlessly, but there is something I like to do when I'm at the mall. And one of the things I really enjoy doing at the mall is what you might call people watching. Right? Anybody ever do that? Right? Guilty? And you know what I'm talking about. You go to the mall and you're tired of walking around, so you sit down, right? And you just sit there and you watch all the interesting people that are walking by, right? And you know what's amazing and what's so fun about it is you think you do. You think you can learn a lot about people through that, right? You make these assumptions usually based on that a little bit, but you can learn a lot. For example, if I see some dude wearing skinny jeans, I can learn a lot, right? Automatically. You're like, "Pastor, you don't like skinny jeans, do you?" No, I don't. If I see somebody carrying a certain bag, right, you can tell a lot, like where they shop and what kind of clothes they wear. You can tell a lot by the people they're walking with. You ever notice that? You're like, "Woo, wow," right? Not being judgmental here, but that's interesting, right? Come on, you've all done it, right? We've all mall watched. We've all been there, and we learn these things about people, or at least we think we learn things about people. The reason I bring that up is as we come to verse 41 today, this in a way is the picture that Mark has painted for us, because as Jesus comes out of the temple, he's coming into what is known as the outer temple area. The technical word for this area is called the court of women. And that's not because it's a mall, okay? But it's called the court of women because it was the boundary, it was as far as the women could go into the temple. You might say, "That sounds sexist, Pastor." It is, all right? I'm just going to tell you. So they could only go to a certain point, right? The court of women, this was the outer temple. And then there's the inner temple, that's, where the sacrifices and the other things happened, and the men got to go in there. That's where Jesus has been. So as he comes out of the inner temple, he comes into the outer temple, he comes into the court of women. And we're told as he comes out into the court of women, he sits down and he begins to watch people. He begins to observe people. He begins, listen to this, to people watch. And he begins to observe some things about the people that are passing in and through this temple area. So what is it he's observing or watching? Well, Mark tells us he watched the people putting money into the offering box. Imagine if Jesus was sitting here watching us take offering. That'd be a little intimidating, wouldn't it? Well, he's watching them, and you might say, well, that's strange. Why would he do that? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. What I want you to understand first is why he would be able to do this. And the reason he's able to do this is because the court of women is also where the temple treasury is located. In other words, it's where they keep their offering buckets. But their offering buckets were a little different than what we're used to. They're not white. They don't have the temple logo on them, okay? That's not what they look like. These are trumpet-shaped receptacles. They go along a wall, and there was 13 of them. For our purposes, we'll call them trumpet buckets, all right? Just to make it simple. And unlike our offering, they didn't pass these around and down the aisles. I mean, they were fixed to the wall, so people had to walk up to them. It was very visible. You could very easily see what people were putting in and what they weren't putting into these trumpet buckets. So apparently Jesus is sitting here. He's watching people. He's people watching, and he's watching how much money people put into these offering buckets. And he makes an observation. Listen to what Mark says. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came up and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. Mark says Jesus is sitting there, and he observes these very wealthy people putting in large sums of money. Now, how does he know they're putting in large sums of money? Well, we just learned it's very public. Everybody can see it. But more than likely, if you're a really rich person and it's a public place where you show people how much you give, they're like, check this out, 100, 200, 300, 400. I mean, look what I'm giving, right? And Jesus, he notices that. Hey, that guy gave $500. Hey, that guy gave $1,000. Hey, that guy gave $2,000. And he's watching this, and apparently as he's watching, another individual walks up, and by the way that she's walking, the clothes she's wearing, her demeanor, he can tell she's a poor widow. How do we know that he knew that? How do you know you see a single mom, right? How do you know when you see a homeless person? There's indicators. He sees an indicator. She's a poor widow, and he watches her as she approaches, the copper or the buckets, and she puts 2 small copper coins in the buckets. So at this point, you're like, what's going on here? Number one, why is Jesus creeping on people, right? And why is this woman so significant? Well, the reason Jesus is watching is he sees this as an opportunity, a moment where he can teach his disciples a kingdom principle for discipleship. Now, the reason he's watching and observing beyond that is he notices what this woman does, and she does something that nobody else is doing. And so he said, I'm going to bring attention to this. So listen to what Mark says. And he called his disciples to him, and he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box. He says, guys, come here. I want to show you something. You see that poor widow woman over there? Listen to this. She just put in 2 small copper coins. And by doing so, she put more in than the thousands of dollars that all those rich people put in before her. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you got to start wondering, well, what's the deal with the copper coins? Are these special copper coins? I mean, is copper worth a lot of money in the first century? Could that be, is it from her copper, penny collection, and it's one of those rare copper pennies that, is worth a lot of money, and Jesus recognized, it's one of those pennies. She just put, wow, look at that. What she put in is more than anybody else. Is that what's going on? No. What's interesting about this is the word that Jesus uses for coin here is lepta in the Greek. And in the first century, a lepton was the smallest coin in circulation. It was worth 1/64th of a day's wage. 1/64th of a day's wage. So think of it like this. Let's say that a day's wage is $100. That would be, in a lepta would be like $1.50. Okay? And so she put 2 lepta in. So based on a $100 wage, she put about $3 into the trumpet bucket. So then a question we have to ask then is, how does $3 equal more than the hundreds and thousands of dollars that the rich people gave ahead of her? Well, Jesus tells us. Listen to what he says. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Jesus says, listen, the reason she gave more is because of where she gave it from. Because she gave it out of her poverty while they gave it out of their abundance. In other words, she gave everything. She walked up. She had a purse with her. She's carrying her purse, like this. Hey, hey, hey. And she walks up and she's got $3 in there. And she dumps it all in the offering. She gets rid of everything. She is penniless now. But the rich, they came up and they gave out of their abundance. In other words, they gave, but they didn't give more than they had. In other words, they still have money in their emergency fund. They still have more than enough to pay their electric bill this week and to go out to eat and go see Infinity War, the Avengers at the movie theater later on. I mean, they've got the money to do that. They still have the ability to go to Walmart today and buy useless pieces of plastic. They can do that. Fact of the matter is, they gave what was comfortable. What they gave didn't put them in a financial bind. What they gave came out of their abundance. They put $200 in, but they had $10,000 in their checking account. So Jesus says, because the widow gave all that she had, because she emptied her purse, she gave more than anybody else. So why is that? Why is Jesus bringing attention to this? Why is he bringing attention to that, to the fact that her $3 equals more than the $1,000 gave? It's because in this case, it's not about how much money she gave, but how much trust and faith she was willing to put in God as her provider. In other words, she gave everything believing that God would provide what she didn't have anymore. What Jesus is trying to help his disciples understand is, listen, if you're going to follow me, she's a great example of what it takes. Somebody who's willing to trust me with everything. Somebody who's willing to give everything and trust me completely. You can learn a thing or two from her. Because, guys, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to give me more than 1% of your trust. More than 5%, more than 10, more than 20, more than 50. You're going to have to give me 100% of your trust. If you really want to follow me, you got to be just like her. That's what he wants his disciples to understand. And a great way to demonstrate it is by going to the thing that we tend to trust God with, or trust ourselves with, and not God with, typically our money. It's a great demonstration. It's a great opportunity for Jesus to illustrate a kingdom principle. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, Pastor, that's interesting, but what does this have to do with my life, and how does this apply to me? And didn't you say this message isn't about giving money, but you sure have talked a lot about giving money here. Here's how this applies to you and I. Here's how this is applicable in the exact same way. This isn't one of those sermons where I say, well, it applied this way in this culture, but in this culture it applies this way. You don't get away with that this morning. It applies in the exact same way. Because the fact of the matter is, if you're going to follow Jesus, it's going to require you to give him 100% of everything. And the reason why some of you are struggling spiritually, even here in this place this morning, is because you haven't done that. The truth is, you give God a certain percent of trust. When it comes to your finances, a certain percent of trust. When it comes to your marriage, a certain percent of trust. When it comes to your parenting, a certain percent of your trust. When it comes to your health or your work or whatever it is, a certain percent is given to God, and the rest you keep for yourself. Some of you, you've got like a governor on your trust. Y'all know what I mean by governor? You know, they put a governor on an engine to keep a vehicle from going a certain speed. For some of you spiritually, you're governed. You won't go past a certain point in your trust with God, and as a result, you're struggling spiritually, and you're missing out on all that God has for you. Because you're governed, you've only given God a certain percent. Let me illustrate it like this, and maybe you know this, and you're a science nerd or something, but at 211 degrees, water is on the brink of reaching a transformational point. Because in just 1 degree, when it reaches 212 degrees, water is going to begin to boil. And as water begins to boil, it begins to create something it couldn't create at 211 degrees. It begins to create steam. And do you realize how powerful steam is? In fact, what have they used steam to power before? Locomotives, right? So think about this. There's a 1 degree difference from 211 to 212, but in that 1 degree difference, water goes through a transformational process that makes it more powerful than it was before. Some of you, spiritually speaking, you're sitting at 211 degrees. You love God. You're trying to live for Him. You're comfortable. You are trusting Him. But what I'd like to suggest to you this morning is, if you're willing to trust God more, if you'd maybe even give Him 1 more degree of trust, it could be the transformational point in your life that changes everything. Changes your marriage, changes your finances, changes your parenting, changes your workplace environment. If you just gave God 1 more degree of trust, a transformational change could take place in your life. 1 degree. Question is, how do we do that? I don't know about you. I'd kind of like to know how that works. How do I trust God with everything? How do I be like that widow woman who was willing to walk up there and empty her purse and trust that God would provide? How do you get to that place? The good news is Jesus tells us, or at least He points us in the right direction here. So as we close and come to the last part of the message this morning, here's what I want to do. I want to give you 2 keys to trusting God. 2 keys that I believe if we would put them in place in our life could move us from 211 to 212 degrees. Here's the first key. I can't trust God with everything until I'm willing to admit, and this is really important, I'm not. I'm not. Listen again to what Mark says. Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. It'd be easy to keep reading and not give a lot of thought to what Mark just said, but Mark really makes an interesting point here, a detail about what Jesus is doing. He says Jesus is watching people put money in the offering bucket. Now, here's what I want you to kind of think about with this, what Mark has just said. Is Jesus really concerned about the amount of money that's being put in? Not so much. What he's concerned about, and what he's really looking for, is the amount of trust that people are putting in God. So here's what that means. Jesus is fully aware of your trust level. Right now, Jesus is sitting in the courtyard of your spiritual life, and He's watching you, and He knows exactly how much trust you're putting in the trust bucket. He knows. He's fully aware. Now, the truth is, we don't often give thought to the fact that God's watching us. What we're more concerned about is what others are watching, what others are seeing. The image that we're trying to portray as we come to church on Sunday and we walk through the doors and we're smiling and we greet and, we look like we got it all together and we raise our hands. Kelly says, raise our hands. Oh, yeah, I'm raising my hands, and then we put some money in the offering bucket, and we take really good sermon notes. Check out my sermon notes. I wrote a lot of scripture down. We got the appearance that we are spiritually rich. The truth is, on the inside, our trust in God isn't where it should be. We're not really trusting God to the degree we should. In fact, we're trusting in other places. We're putting our trust in our circumstances. The reason you walk through the door and you're smiling is because you feel good about where your checking account is. You feel good about where your health is. You're trusting God as long as everything in your life is in the abundance, right? But the truth is, we're not trusting Him in our poverty. We've got this facade on, and while you may be fooling Jesus, or you're fooling everybody else, you're not fooling Jesus, are you? Jesus is watching. He knows exactly where you are when it comes to your trust in Him. And here's what God is looking for. He's not looking for the person that walks through the door and appears to have it all together. He's looking for the person who walks in and is willing to be honest. The person who's willing to say, listen, I'm spiritually broken. I'm spiritually destitute. I'm spiritually poor. I don't have it all together. I'm not where I need to be with God. I'm not trusting Him like He should. He's looking for someone like that poor widow who is willing to be transparent. Somebody willing to be honest about their spiritual condition. You might wonder, why is He looking for somebody like that, Pastor? Because until you're willing to admit how spiritually destitute you are, you won't be able to trust God. You will keep trusting in whatever else you're putting your trust in. In other words, God can't give you everything until you come to the end of yourself. Until you're willing to admit and acknowledge that without Him, you're not going to make it. You have to come to this point that you realize, listen, I need Him. When you are fully transparent enough to say, you know what, God, I really haven't been trusting you like I should. I've been acting like it. People think I am, but I'm really not. It's an interesting story in 2 Chronicles 16, and it's about a king named Asa. And Asa had the appearance of being a very godly king. In fact, at one point, he called for a sacrifice at the temple, and everybody came to town, everybody came to Jerusalem, and Asa, listen to this, he sacrificed 700 oxen and 7,000 sheep all at once. And then he made a covenant before all the people and before the Lord and said, Lord, as a people, we're going to trust you heart and soul. And he said, and if anybody here, if you don't do that, we're going to kill you. Wow. You guys, radical, right? You know what's interesting, though, is one day an enemy king came against Asa, and instead of trusting God, Asa took matters into his own hands. When the enemy came to his doors, Asa went to the temple and he took the gold and silver and he stripped the temple of all the gold and silver and stripped the treasury, and he took it and he hired mercenaries to defend the kingdom. And while it worked to some degree, it really angered God, because in that moment Asa decided to trust man over trusting God. And so God sends a prophet to Asa to kind of scold him and to reprimand him. Listen to what the prophet says to him. The prophet says, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless towards Him. You have done foolishly in this, for from now on you will have wars." The prophet says, Asa, let me remind you of something. God is watching. He's looking for people who trust Him. He's looking for people who quit putting their hope in themselves and put their hope in Him. Asa, you haven't done that. And because you've done this, because you hired the mercenaries, it's going to be a whole lot worse than it could have been. You're going to now have wars. See, Asa had the appearance of giving everything. He sacrificed 7,000 sheep. He made a covenant, right? But when push came to shove, he really didn't trust God. How did he respond to the prophet? Well, you'd like to think Asa repented and asked for forgiveness, but listen to what happened. Then Asa was angry with the seer and put him in the stocks in prison, for he was enraged with him because of this. And Asa afflicted cruelties upon some of the people at the same time. Asa didn't respond well, did he? He showed his true colors. Here's what we need to understand. If you want to trust God with everything, you have to start by admitting you're not. And the truth is, some of you, even in this room, you have the appearance of trusting God, but the reality is your trust is limited. You only trust God to a certain point, to a certain degree. You're only willing to go to 211. You're not willing to take that step to 212. And you just need to be honest with yourself that you're not trusting Him like you should. That's the first step. To be honest enough to say, no, I don't fully trust God financially, because if I did, I would tithe. Isn't that true? To say, you know what, no, I don't fully trust God with my work situation, because if I did, I wouldn't be laying awake at night worrying.
To be honest enough to say, no, I don't really trust God with my marriage, because if I did, I wouldn't be constantly trying to fix my spouse. To be honest enough to say, no, I don't really trust Jesus fully with my life, because if I did, I wouldn't be questioning his word all the time. I wouldn't be, thinking I have to prove myself to him. You see how that works? The only way you can start trusting God with everything, the only way you can move from 211 to 212 degrees, is to admit that you're not doing that. You might have fooled others. You might even have fooled yourself, but you haven't fooled God. He is fully aware. He is watching. And he's looking for the person that's willing to admit, God, I need you. Second key, I can't trust God with everything if I'm not willing to give him everything. And really the key word there is willing. Listen again to what Mark writes. And he called his disciples to him, and he said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on. What I want you to see here is the contrast that Jesus makes. He says, the rich person, their trust in God is based on what they have left over after giving to God. What's comfortable. What they feel like they can afford to give. And to be honest, that's how many Christians operate. Let me give you an example of how I know this, and it is a money example. When it comes to church finances, here's like one of the first things you learn as a pastor is that people give in seasons, okay? And they give more and less in certain seasons. And it's not based because they're getting, honestly, it's not because their paychecks are different in different seasons. It's because their circumstances are different in different seasons. Y'all following me? You want to know when the best season for the church is financially? Between the months of February and the first part of April. Why do you think that is? Tax returns. People are getting refunds. They're getting an abundance back. And it's real easy when you're living in abundance to say, oh, 10% of $1,000, $100, I can give that to the church because I got $900 of unexpected abundance sitting in my checking account. And it's real easy for people to give in their abundance. You know when the worst time of the year for giving at the church is? January. Want to know why? Because people are getting credit card statements from December in the mail. People are tapped out from the holiday season, and they're like, oh my gosh, we can't afford to give to God this month. We're going to have to hold back, but we got a tax return coming. We'll be in our abundance soon, but right now we're in our poverty, and we can't trust God. That's what happens. See how that works? And for some people, they only give out of their abundance when it is comfortable. This is the point Jesus is trying to make here. He's saying, listen, some people only trust God in their abundance when it's comfortable. But the poor woman, she's different. Her trust in God isn't seasonal. It's not based on some tax return that's coming in the mail. She didn't just get done, with TurboTax and go, woohoo, I'm going to go to the temple and get my pennies. It's not based on anything like that. It's based on what she doesn't have. It's based on her giving everything. She's willing to trust God when it's not comfortable, willing to trust God when the tax return isn't there. She's willing to give God everything, willing to trust him based on what she doesn't yet have. Now, you might be thinking, well, Pastor, are you saying in order to trust God with everything, I have to empty my checking account? Are you saying that I have to give the full tax return? Oh, you just love that, wouldn't you, Pastor? Give the full tax return to the church? Is that what you're saying, Pastor? That's not what I'm saying. But listen very carefully. What I'm saying is you better be willing to. See the difference? That's the difference. You better be willing to. Not just financially, but in every part of your life. Let me explain it like this. Let's say that this morning you heard God speak to you. How many of you have ever been at church and God spoke to you? Right? What if God this morning said to you, or you, or you, or you, hey, I want you to sell everything, move to Africa, live in a hut, and be a missionary. That'd be some word, wouldn't it? How would you respond to that? You know what I think most of us would do? I think we'd argue with God on that a little bit. We'd push back, a little resistance. Let me give some pushback here, God. How about this? Because I don't know, sell everything, move to Africa, live in a hut? That's pretty extreme, God. How about this? How about instead, when the offering bucket comes around, I'll put in some extra money for missions? How about that, God? Will that work? Oh, no, I got a better idea. How about this, God? This is better, God. How about this? I've got a week's paid vacation coming. Why don't I go on a missions trip to Africa? Because I can afford to. I'll still get paid while I'm gone, and I can go to Africa. How about we do that, God? See how that works? Oftentimes, we're not willing to do what God asks us to do. We're willing to trust him because it's not comfortable. A lot of unknowns there. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, Pastor, how do you know I wouldn't go to Africa? No. Maybe I would. Here's how I know you wouldn't go to Africa. I know because most of us aren't doing what God asks us to do in the simple things, let alone the big things. We're not trusting him in the small areas of life versus why would we go to Africa when we can't trust him with our finances? When we can't trust him with our marriage? When we can't trust him with our kids? Here's how I know that, because we're not trusting him in little things he's asking us to do. For example, God has asked us to give 10% back to him, but the truth is most of us don't do that. Why? It's not comfortable. We don't feel like we can afford it because it would require us to trust God in our poverty, not our abundance, right? Most of us, we say, you know what, I'm trusting God with my marriage, but the truth is you're not doing that because it wouldn't be comfortable. To trust God in your marriage would require you to quit trying to fix your spouse. It would require you to love them, even when they're not lovable or loving you back. It would require you to trust God in your poverty, not your abundance. God has asked us to trust him with our children, but the truth is some of us aren't doing that. Why? Not comfortable. Requires us to quit coming to their rescue. It requires us to allow, some suffering and some consequences to maybe take place in their life. It requires us to maybe, trust God in our poverty rather than our abundance. A few years ago, I had a woman in the church. She came up to me and she said, Pastor, I want to tell you a little story about how God worked in my son's life. It was a process for me and him. She began to tell me how for years her son ran from God, was away from God. And she would just pray every day, God, fix him, get a hold of him. And she would begin to pray, God, do this, put this person in their life, Lord. And she had all these things that she wanted God to do to get her son right. And she said, finally, I just got so frustrated one day. I said, God, why aren't you getting involved in his life? Why aren't you doing what I've asked you to do? She said in that moment, God spoke to her. He said, you know what, I've been trying to, but every time I do, you get in the way. Every time I put him in a situation where he's going to have to turn to me, you bail him out. Every time I put him in a position where he's going to have to submit to me, you wrestle him out of my hands. See, the truth is, God has asked us to trust him, but instead of trusting, we want to take the situation into our own hands because trusting God means it's uncomfortable. It forces us to trust him in our poverty, not our abundance. You see, in order to trust God with everything, you have to be willing to actually trust him with everything. And the problem for so many of us is we say we trust God, and in some areas I think we genuinely do, but when push comes to shove, we're not really to trust him with everything. It goes to a certain degree, a certain point, a certain percent, and then we stop. And we stop. Fact of the matter is, God has asked us, again, to trust him with our finances. But here's the deal. Let me ask you this question. If we're not willing to trust him with 10% of our income, how would we ever trust him 100% with our salvation? How could we trust him with 100% of our marriage? How could we trust him with 100% of our situations in life if we can't even trust him with 10% of our income? Fact of the matter is, you have to be willing. Listen, this is where you got to get to. Right? This sounds radical. You have to get to the place where you'd be willing, if God asked you to do it, that you would give him 100% of your income and not even think about it. You'd walk right up and empty your purse and say, I trust you. Jesus says, that's what it takes to follow me. And the proof of it is seen in his example. Because Jesus was willing to give 100% of his life, and he did. Willing to do something that wasn't comfortable. Willing to leave his throne, willing to leave his kingdom, willing to come down to earth, willing to become a servant, willing to get on a cross and give his life 100%, not 10%, not 20%, not 50%, but 100% for you. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says. This is an amazing passage of Scripture. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his, listen to this, so important, poverty might become rich. Jesus gave out of what? His poverty. Was Jesus up with his crown on in his kingdom when he saved you? When he did what it took for you to be saved, was he in his abundance? No. He was in his poverty. He's on a cross, nailed to it, dying. Why? So you could become rich. Now here's what's amazing is that God actually honors that sacrifice. Listen to what Paul tells us. Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. What Jesus wants his disciples to understand is that following him will require them to give and have a willingness to give everything just like he did. A willingness to go when he says go, a willingness to sacrifice when he says sacrifice, a willingness to be uncomfortable when he says move into that position, a willingness to step into the unknown, a willingness to trust God in your poverty, not your abundance. And to believe that as you trust him, just like the Father took care of him, he will take care of you. See, this is true for you and I, isn't it? Following Jesus requires us to give him everything. So as we close this morning, I want to leave you with 3 questions to consider to help you evaluate maybe where you're at in your trust bucket. First question, when it comes to your life, have you put your hope and trust in Jesus? In other words, have you come to that place where you recognize your need for a Savior, that you recognize that without Jesus, that, listen, you're done for, you're in trouble? Are you following Jesus? I'd like to think that most of us in the room are this morning, but maybe you're not. Maybe you've never made that decision to follow him, and maybe you've been trying to live life for you and on your own and without anybody but yourself. And the truth of the matter is, if you're really honest this morning, if you be honest with yourself, it's not working. Something's missing. Something's wrong. In fact, that's why you came to church today, because you know something's wrong, something's missing. And so you've come here today and you're looking for it. And there's good news for you this morning. It's here. He's here. His name is Jesus. And if you'll put your faith in him and your hope in him and you'll trust him, he can rescue you. He promises he will. He became poor so you could become spiritually rich, so that your relationship with God could be restored. So are you following him as you're trusting him? Second question, if you are following him, what % would you say of your trust is in him? In other words, as you think about your walk with Jesus, to what degree do you trust him? To what degree are you trusting him financially? To what degree are you trusting him in your marriage or with your kids or in your work situation? I mean, just in your life, as you look at your life, to what degree are you trusting him? I ask you that question because here's just the truth. To the degree you trust him is the degree to which he can work in your life. And the fact of the matter is, for God to work in your life is going to require you to trust him more. To go from 211 to 212 degrees, you have to trust him more. Trust him more financially. Trust him more relationally. Trust him more in all these areas of your life. Because the truth is, if you want more of God in your situation, then you need more. You have to give him more trust, more ability for him to work in your situation. To what degree, to what percent would you say that you're trusting God? Final question, and as the worship team comes, are you willing, and again the key word here is willing, to give up everything to follow him? In other words, if Jesus asked you to give something up for him, no matter what it was, would you be willing to do that? And you know what I think? I don't think it starts with, would you go to Africa for me? I don't think God starts there with us. I think he starts with some simple stuff first. Would you be willing to give up spending all your time on Facebook and spend some time with me? Would you be willing to give me that time? Would you be willing to give up some unhealthy friendships that really aren't helping you? Would you be willing, maybe to even quit watching some shows that aren't speaking truth into your life and that aren't helping you trust me more, but are leading you down a path of lies and deceits? Would you be willing to trust me a little bit more? Would you be willing to trust me with your kids? I know you're trying to fix them. I know you don't want them to get hurt, but would you be willing to maybe put them in my hands and believe that I love them more than you do? See, I think that's where God's going to start. He's going to start in some of these areas of your life where it's just really simple, but it's so simple that you got control of it, and you're thinking, well, God doesn't want control of this. He can't help with this. I'll do it. And God's saying, I do, and that's where it starts. You got to admit that you need me, right? Are you willing to give something up in order to trust him with everything? How far are you willing to take your trust? Because the truth is, God can only take you as far as you're willing to go. And here's what we have to believe, that where God wants to take us is better than where we're at. I don't want to stay at 211 degrees and just be, hot water. I want to be boiling. I want to produce things in my life that have power in them and that move the kingdom of God forward. Don't you? But again, for that to happen, you and I have to start living not out of our abundance, but trusting him in our poverty. Amen? Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning. We thank you for your word. And Lord, it's a powerful object lesson about trust. It's not about how much money we're giving. It's about how much trust we're willing to give you. And Lord, I think I can speak for all of us that we all struggle with that, Lord, in different parts of our lives. And so, Lord, for all of us this morning, help us to trust you, Lord. And it's different areas, but Lord, whether it's finances or relationships or something work-related or whatever it is, God, help us to trust you more today. Help us to move another degree towards a point where you could really do something transformational in us.